Well, the House budget blueprint cuts $10 billion from the agriculture budget over 10 years, and Democrats say the cuts could make it even harder to pass a farm bill. The Republicans' budget doesn't stipulate how lawmakers should come up with savings, but recommends giving states more responsibility for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as food stamps. Representative Jim McGovern says he thinks the budget cuts could, quote, kill the farm bill, end quote, while Representative Colin Peterson says singling out SNAP to bear the brunt of cuts will certainly make it harder. The Senate marks up its agriculture spending bill this morning, and they're expected to adopt an amendment reinstating the Undersecretary for Rural Development. Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue eliminated that position, instead establishing an assistant to the secretary focused exclusively on rural development issues. Perdue described that move as elevating the importance of rural development, but legislators disagree, saying the rural economy's tough and it needs proper leadership. In the face of shrinking budgets, ag lawmakers make ambitious plans for rural infrastructure. Sarah Mock has the details from Washington.
Chairman Conaway began his hearing with a gloomy picture of the challenge of rural infrastructure.
It's a cycle that seems unbreakable. Services are lacking, so families move out. As families move out, the tax base shrinks, and as the tax base shrinks, services must be curtailed and upgrades must be postponed.
Since President Trump announced his billion-dollar infrastructure plan earlier this year, details on his proposal have been thin. But House lawmakers hope to use the Farm Bill to support that agenda.
GAO estimates that almost $190 billion is needed to cover the costs of replacing outdated rural water and wastewater infrastructure. The Federal Communications Commission estimated that nearly 40% of rural Americans do not have access to the current FCC target for ideal minimum internet service.
The water and wastewater systems, electric cooperatives, and even agricultural research were discussed. Insufficient funding for rural broadband was the key issue, as it affects hundreds of thousands of rural households.
And that one ties a certain number of locations to a certain amount of money. That one is underfunded currently by $110 million. And we know, because it's tied to numbers and locations, how many consumers that affects. So that's going to affect 70,000 rural Americans that are going to get less broadband than they would under full funding, and 50,000 additional rural Americans probably will receive no broadband because of that underfunding.
Installing fiber for rural broadband won't be enough, Otwell says, as maintaining the system requires ongoing funding, especially when there are only about 3 households per mile of line. But Otwell says it's not just those rural areas that benefit.
Just rural broadband infrastructure contributed $24 billion to the nation's economy as a whole, and that 2/3 of that actually benefited urban Americans, with only 1/3 of it benefiting rural Americans. And so just like you said, they need us, we need them. And so anything we can do, like providing adequate broadband in rural areas, everything we do to make rural areas more efficient saves money for urban Americans too.
When it comes to rural infrastructure, making investments in a sustainable system will be key to ensuring that communities stay connected, both physically to urban and global markets, and virtually to hospitals, business and educational opportunities, and of course, to each other. For RFD-TV, Sarah Mock, Washington.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, experts also address the regulatory process. On average, infrastructure programs in the U.S. take about 10 years to complete the permitting process versus 18 months in countries like New Zealand.